So here, yes, and then back up.
When thinking about the correlation between big groups and big gods, what's cause and what's the effect? Is it that big groups need to invent a big god in order to function, or is it that the invention of the big god allows the formation of the big group?
So, the question is, bigger groups have bigger gods, but which way does the causal arrow go?
If I had my way, I would do an experiment where I would randomly assign cultures to a big god and see what happens. Great question. I totally agree with you. This is obviously a cross-cultural pattern that is correlational. What is cause and what is effect? I can say a couple of things that that are encouraging and could help us think further about causality. So the authors of this research, Rose and Raymond, they controlled for a number of other alternative explanations. So, for example, they controlled for missionary activity. So you could argue that this is just a spurious correlation. Societies that are missionized get bigger and also have belief in moralizing gods, the Abrahamic God. But that's not true because that is true. That correlation exists, but if you parcel that out, you still get this effect. Another alternative explanation is inequality, that societies propagate moralizing gods as a way of justifying inequality. It's also been supported. More stratification, caste or political stratification, is associated with more moralizing gods across the cultures. But again, you control for that statistically, you still get this effect. Population density is another one that they control for. But the root of your question, I think, it's a tough one. How do we go back in time? And then, if you have any ideas of how to do it, I'd like to hear it. But that's a good, important caveat, important caution to think of this as a correlation, not causation.
Right.
I read recently that researchers had identified big gods as part of the brain. And I was wondering if you're aware of that. That it's just something the media is kind of blown out of proportion, or how it relates to...
Yeah, don't believe it.
So there's some media report that some researchers have discovered a part of the brain that is dedicated to thinking about these things.
Yeah, if that was true, that would be an extraordinary piece of scientific news, don't you think? Here is the issue. What some researchers do in the neurosciences is they have someone pray, for example, or meditate, and then they measure their brain. They put them in a brain scanner, for example, and they see that the brain lights up, certain parts of the brain lights up when they do that. So, for example, when meditators, Buddhist meditators, are having this experience of losing their self, do you see that the part of the brain that deals with separating the self with the rest of the world is suppressed? Well, yeah, I mean, anything you do is in the brain, right? So that in itself is not an argument that there's a part of the brain that makes you believe in God. It's not like language, for example, where if you have a mental deficit in certain brain areas like the Broca's or Wernicke's area, you have a selective deficit of language behavior, right? So there's nothing like that I know of. The only closest thing I can think of is brain areas that are involved in theory of mind reasoning. But even then, you have to understand that theory of mind itself is not where God resides. It's loosely related to our supernatural beliefs, and that's why you might get the deficit.
Here.
The previous talk had to do with correlation of genetics with psychosis of various kinds. Have you tried to do any genetics correlation with any of your experiments? Is that too expensive now today? You know, it's getting cheaper and cheaper to do DNA.
So can we go back to Greg's question? Can we actually start looking for genes that might predispose us to or away from religious beliefs? Is that what you're... Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not a geneticist, or I don't have any expertise in that area, so I wouldn't be able to do it. So if someone was going to do it, it's not going to be me. I'm a social psychologist. There is some research on heritability of religiosity. So you find that, for example, and the research in this area is the standard methods of looking at adoption studies, you're looking at twin studies, and you find that there is some heritability of religiosity. Now, that's kind of mildly interesting, but it's not super interesting because everything is heritable. Political attitudes are heritable, right? So, so I think what's going on is that it's not that religiosity is heritable, it's not that political orientation is heritable, it's some kind of temperament underlying it is heritable. So it's possible that, for example, intolerance of uncertainty as a temperament might be heritable, and people who are intolerant of uncertainty might be more likely to become religious. I'm speculating here, but that's the kind of thing that's the line of reasoning I would take for these studies. But actual genetic studies on religiosity, I don't know of any that have been done.
Yes, so at the back, right there. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Along the lines of the Buddhism question, there's a strain of environmentalists who seem to raise environmentalism to a level of religious belief, and the United States has elicited from some conservative religions a great deal of animosity because they see it as a threat to God-driven religious religion. What is your opinion of this?
So the comment is that there is some evidence, or there are some people who take an ecological view of the world but raise it to something that looks like a religion, specifically in the United States, that raises animosity among other religions that we all know about. And do you have any comments on that?
I see what you mean, and many people also give other examples. They say, is communism religion, for example? My view on this is that it's just a question of semantics. It really doesn't matter if you call it a religion or not. That's not the question that we're interested in at least in this line of research. What we want to do is explain particular kinds of tendencies and behaviors, right? You see what I mean? So if they're passionately committed to their cause, if they require costly behaviors from their members, that's interesting. We can explain and understand that, try to understand it. Is it religion? I wouldn't call it religion because it lacks the supernatural element. But if you really want to call it religion, that's fine too. It's a little bit like government, like how do you define government? Do you have to have a Supreme Court to have a government? Or is executive enough? It's not an interesting question in my mind. It's just what you need to explain is how does the executive function? How does the parliament function? How does the court functions, etc., and maybe how they relate to each other.
There's a question down here. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I've been kind of interested in the idea of religion as riding on the parent-child relationship, so that parental imaginary figures in heaven would be overseeing a bunch of roughly fictive kin, and that would create a big supersized family.
Right.
And
So
you think of the Lord's Prayer and so on, you can see where that imagery is certainly used. So is anybody working on that or doing anything with that idea?
So could you comment on the fact that tends to be a family element to the way we think about our supernatural gods as parents?
A great question, and yes, there is. You should look up someone called Lee Kirkpatrick. He's a psychologist who has done research on this topic, and there is evidence that people project their own experiences, their experience of their parents onto their religious beliefs. So it does seem to be that there is some truth to the idea that we overgeneralize our attachment experiences from our family to our understanding of supernatural beings.
And that can be culturally exploited, I guess, as well.
Same thing, yeah, exactly. It's again same process, right? We have an ordinary psychology that's working. We have attachment psychology that helps us deal with parents, and then you have this cultural process that exploits that tendency.